Let's talk about creating lists of data in Python. In other languages, lists may be called arrays. So in my example here, I have 3 different variables, right, to hold 3 different scores: score 1, score 2, and score 3. So in memory, I have score 1, and it has a value of 98. Score 2 has a value of 100, and score 3, it has a value of 91. And if I want to print the scores, right, I can just say print score 1 and then score 1, right? And it'll print score 1 and then 98. Let's try that out, score 1 and 98. Well, what if I wanted to store 100 scores, right? I wouldn't really want to create 100 different variables. So that's where lists come in handy. And to create a list, you just give the list a name. So I'm going to make a list of scores. And then you can create an empty list by adding those brackets. So that creates an empty list. If I want to create a list with items in it, I can just list the items right in the list. So 98, 100, 91. Okay, and then when I print scores, you'll see what prints 98, 100, 91, and it has the little brackets on either side. So those are my scores. So how lists are stored in memory is instead of 3 separate variables like up here, we have a variable called scores. And when I created the list, it created 3 separate variables right next to each other in memory. And it put a 98 in the first variable, 100 in the second variable, and 91 in the third variable. And we don't call these variables when we're talking about a list. We call these cells. So these are cells. And the value that's in the cell is called an element. And how we get to those elements is through something called an index. So every cell has a unique index number starting at 0. So 0, 1, and 2. It's kind of like when you go to the post office and you have all the mailboxes and they all have numbers on them, starting at 0, like 0, 1, 2. And then if I want to put something into a mailbox, right, I have to go to that number and then I can put something in there. So it's kind of, similar to that. And so every cell has an index, and then to access the element in the cell, we use this notation. So I can say print, and then we give it the name of the list, and then a square bracket, and then the index number. So this is the location of where the data is stored, right? So this is scores, and then we say, how we read this out loud is we say scores sub 0. And if I were to change that to a 1, this would be scores sub 1. So when I print out score sub 0, what's going to be printed? 98. And if I print out scores sub 2, it's going to give me the third element, 91. So if I create an array or a list with 100 elements, what are those indexes going to be? So if I have an array with 100 elements, the first element will always be at index 0, and then if there are 100 of them, that means the last one would be at 99. So this number, this last index, is always going to be 1 less than the number of elements that you have in the list. Okay, so you can just keep that in mind. So how do I change the values in the list once the list is created. So again, I'm going to have to access the list item or the list element using the index. So I'm going to draw this again. This is 0, 1, 2, 98, 100, and 91. So if I want to update this value to, let's say we want it to be 88, I'll have to use the index of the list to get to that location. So I will say scores sub 1 is assigned 88. And then when I print that, I can just, actually I'll print the array or the list. And then I'll print the list again down here after I've changed the value. So you can see the first time I print the list, it's 98, 100, 91. But after I set index 1 to 88, then it changes the index 1, which is the second element, to 88. So this is the first element at index 0, the second element at index 1, and the third element at index 2. And then after your list is created, we can use append and remove to add and remove items from the list. So I can start with an empty list, and I can say scores.append, and then I'll append 98, and scores.append 100, scores.append 91. And then if I print the list, you can see it's 98, 100, and 91. And to remove items from a list, I can say scores.remove, and then I can pick an item in the list. So let's say I want to remove 98. And then I'll print the list again. So it was 98, 100, and 91, and then when I did a remove, it's going to remove the first occurrence of that number. If there were multiple, like if I change this to 98, 98, 98, 91, and then I remove it, it changes, it will just delete the first occurrence. We can try that again. Let's say this is 91 and this is 98. So 98, 91, 98. And again, when I did the remove, it removed the first occurrence of 98, which was in cell 0. And then I'm left with 91 and 98. So go ahead and open an IDE of your choice and then just play around with append and remove and accessing elements using the index of the list.